Good morning, I'm John Pendlebury. I work in the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape at Newcastle University, and I'm here talking this morning with Jill Haley.
Yes, I'm Jill Haley. I'm Chief Executive of the Byker Community Trust, and I'd worked in housing for 40 years now.
So we are here to talk about housing. Good housing, I think, was always an integral part of the welfare state when the welfare state was created in the post-war period, just as much as healthcare, just as much as education. And we seem to have, at times, a bit of a collective amnesia about that over the last 40 years, just how important housing is to people's life chances and how integrally good housing is related to those other factors of good health and people flourishing and succeeding. Now, what we're going to talk about specifically is the Byker estate in Newcastle upon Tyne. And the Byker estate was created as part of that vision of housing, of good housing, decent housing, being an integral part of society and for something which everybody should have access to. It was created quite late in that process, in the 1970s, and was a different sort of response to the issue of kind of creating good housing. It was less paternalistic. It was less telling people exactly what they needed and providing it, as had happened in the 1950s and 1960s, and was an attempt with Ralph Erskine, the architect, and his team to have, perhaps co-creation would be going too far, but to involve people much more in terms of the housing which was being created for them, with the intention that people who had always lived in Byker would be rehoused close to where they'd lived and alongside their friends and neighbours. Now, Byker was made quite cheaply, but with the expectation there would be money to maintain it. And that didn't really happen. In the 1980s, that money disappeared. And things reached a bit of a crisis in the late 1990s when Newcastle City Council, who owned the estate, decided that the way to deal with the problems in Byker was to start demolishing parts of the estate. That led to a reaction, particularly from architects who saw the kind of the quality of Ralph Erskine's design and the process which led to that design, and became a kind of campaign for Byker to be protected, to be saved, to be listed as of architectural historic importance. Very long story, which is not our focus this morning, but that ultimately happened in 2008. And that led to a recognition that the future of the estate demanded a slightly different approach from the management of what we used to call council housing, what we now call social housing. And a commission created by the government recommended the creation of a new body to manage that estate, to manage Byker estate. And that eventually led to the creation of the Byker Community Trust, now under the coalition government in 2012. And Jill, I'm sat with, was appointed to be the Chief Executive of the Byker Community Trust. So I thought, Jill, what we might possibly start with is just your first impressions of Byker.
For me, Byker was always seen as a unique community, and maybe that's because it was associated with its unique Grade 2 star design and listing. But it was a unique area when I was at university doing my degree. There was lots of people, including myself, even though we were based in Newcastle, travelling from abroad to look at Byker because of its iconic design, etc. And yet, the paradox of that was that it was in the national press, it was in the local press for developing stigma and bad reputation for crime and antisocial behaviour. So when the thought of becoming the chief executive of a housing association who would then own this estate was put into my mind, first impressions was, oh my goodness, this needs radical change. Am I up for that?
And so what did you think the challenges were going to be when you first arrived at Byker?
There was two sides to the challenge with Byker. One was the business side, because the whole reason for the stock transfer and for Byker to transfer out of the ownership of the City Council to become an independent housing association was to bring essential investment into the area that the council couldn't afford. Because if Byker needed 20 million, then Scotswood needed 20 million, and then Cowgate needed 20 million, and they really had to bean count and ration, and they didn't have the money that Byker needed. Because of its grade 2 star listing, the specification in Byker was a lot more expensive, and what Byker needed was a lot of essential investment into the infrastructure, the Byker wall, windows, doors, fire safety, other compliance issues. The district heating system was dropping to bits underground and needed massive repair work doing to it. So there was the business challenges with Byker and being able to get and secure a private loan in order to fund that. And then there was the community challenges. There was a lot of empty properties. It had no waiting lists. There was a lot of people living there who wanted to be out. I think it was something like 70% of the population had transfer applications in to move elsewhere, and yet there was no waiting list to move into Byker. So there was quite a lot of business challenges as well as the community challenges that I was faced with at the front end.
And in terms of that community that you found when you arrived in Byker, I mean, as you said, really, I think Byker, in my mind, always had a kind of strong reputation as having a strong identity, having a strong community identity, going back to the 1970s and all the kind of community groups which existed and so on. But it sounds in a way like that community was under a lot of stress and had really suffered. Was what you found when you arrived. I mean, was it a community which was sort of disengaged or
disempowered? Disempowered. These were disempowered people who felt no one cared about them. And when I say no one, I meant the state, people around them, their neighbours, etc. And a lot of this comes down to the indices of deprivation. And if you when I looked at those initially in 2012, when I was brought into Newcastle before the transfer of the estate, we were in the lowest 1% across all of the indices for health and well-being, education, employment, etc. And the expected life, the life expectancy of a male child born in Byker was 11.8 years less than the national average. So coming with that was a plethora of disease and poor health in young people, not just in old people, And so these people had so many barriers and challenges. The literacy age, the average literacy age, I think was 8 when we first come into Byker. That went up to 11, but still massively off the national average, and the unemployment rates were high. And for those who worked in Byker, the majority of them were working in a low economic situation, had manual work, sometimes just temporary contracts or casual contracts, so in and out of work. And it was very difficult circumstances. No wonder these people felt disempowered. And one thing that they could empower themselves was to move. And unfortunately, that was one of my biggest challenges, persuading people not to move and for people to come and live in the area, to get a better economic balance of people living and to create a real community again.
So I think what that very quickly illustrates is, we can think you're coming in, Byker Community Trustees Housing Association. In our minds, housing associations might be essentially about maintaining bricks and mortar. But I think what you're very quickly illustrating is your job could never be just about that. Of course, that was an important part, and securing the investment to make those better places to live, which we all want to live in a nice, comfortable, warm, safe, secure house. So that's clearly a key part of it. But what you're illustrating, I think, is that there was a whole set of other issues which you had to deal with, which you couldn't just say, well, that's not my job. I'm just your landlord. So when you started talking to that community, what were they saying to you? What is it that they wanted? When
I came to Byker, in my interview, my presentation was about, this is how I will change Byker. And it wasn't about spending money, it was about making people feel differently and behave differently. It was about culture and leadership and empowering a disempowered community, which at the time, in early 2012, people thought that wasn't achievable, but I knew it was. Because I had used this leadership approach before and it worked elsewhere. So this was a sideways move for me, and the bounty was always about succeeding in the empowerment of this community and changing the way people behaved and the way people perceived Byker to be. So starting that change meant conversations with the community, who were quite hostile to me initially, if I'm honest.
Well, I imagine trust must be an issue. I mean, for people who felt that they've been kind of neglected in terms of trust with anybody who's got a title after the name and some authority must be an issue.
Yeah.
So how did you go about building that trust, I suppose?
Well, I started by insisting that I was based on the estate and that I was accessible to everyone. The first thing I did is send a letter around all the community, inviting them in to talk to me. They were quite hostile. They were saying they'd heard everything I'd said before. I was just another person from another area who wanted to make a name for myself. So the first thing I did was to make sure that there was good communication, which to set up a tenants newsletter written by tenants for tenants. What they'd want to see in their language, if you like, and support them with that. And to embark on a massive community consultation, not a letter drop, not a phone call, get an independent company to come in, and this was the first thing I did, to talk and work with the community in different community groups, because there was a lot of different community groups within Byker who were operating on their own merits and off their own back, but they weren't joined up. They came back with a community engagement strategy, as I would take to my board very quickly and get it agreed, that the tenants had written, the residents had written for themselves, and it had 4 elements. The first element was about two-way engagement, face-to-face. They wanted to see the whites of your eyes to see if you were lying to them. That was the trust element that you talked about, John. The second one was about helping them to develop insight and interpersonal relationships, bringing those groups together. Hard-to-reach groups, different types of ethnic groups, groups of women, groups of men, groups of children, particularly the children who had nothing to do. And that was one of the biggest problems for families on the estate. They thought that there was nothing safe for children to do on an evening, on a weekend, holidays, etc. So helping them to overcome those barriers, leading to capacity building, helping individuals to overcome barriers by working with the groups and overcoming barriers, people who didn't have the confidence to tell you what their problems were. And very quickly I realised a lot of that was about income maximisation, whether that's about benefits or about people on low wages, etc. So I seconded somebody in from the Citizens Advice Bureau full-time to support the community, and they loved that. And that led then to the final point, which was empowerment. They wanted to be empowered. They just didn't know how to be, but they wanted it in a meaningful way, not paying lip service and chalk and talk. They wanted to influence the business, they wanted to influence the service, and make the directions for the community that they wanted, not what we thought they wanted. So that was really important to them.
Yeah. And I know, throughout the period when you were Chief Executive of the Byker Community Trust, things which are happening in the external world weren't always very helpful for you. So that must have made your life doubly difficult, in the sense that people are expecting things of you now, but things which you didn't always have control over.
There was challenges. We worked very closely with our strategic partners, with the council, with the police, with the headmasters and headmistresses the heads from the schools, and with the community organisations that were already operating in Byker, to have a collaborated approach and to roll out the strategy for Byker Community Trust, which became the Thrive in Byker strategy. Phase 1, it's in phase 2 now, but the first phase of that was to try and help to overcome some of those challenges, whether they were welfare reforms or whether there were things like mental health issues, because you're right, the local authority's budget was being cut year on year, and the services, whether it was social care or outreach, that they were offering were gradually getting reined in, because they had to make some very difficult choices. And it was my staff that were dealing with these issues on the doorstep. So there were no longer housing officers who dealt with lettings and repairs and maintenance and perhaps the odd knock on the door for rent arrears. These were people who were dealing with complex issues. But that was right, because they became the account managers and the people who residents trusted. The staff, the frontline staff, who were empowered to make decisions on the doorstep, on the estate. Sometimes they might have made the wrong decisions, but they were allowed to do that. We learnt from all of our mistakes and we moved on. But those staff were the critical linchpin between the community and the Byker Community Trust.
So again, it's very much that point that technically you're a housing association, but in reality, you and your colleagues were supporting people in every aspect of their daily lives, really, and necessarily having to do that in the absence of the other services, which you're not being there often.
Yeah, and so it was critical that I got staff who were passionate about doing that, who enjoyed doing that, who enjoyed being proactive, and who loved the thought of making a difference on a daily basis.
And we'll come back and talk a little bit more about the estate in a minute and the way that you succeeded in shifting the reputation locally. But you touched upon something else there in terms of the difficulty, how long it takes to shift the reputation of somewhere which, rightly or wrongly, has gained a bad reputation in the wider city. And I think, from when we talked, before you'd be kind of endlessly frustrated with the chronicle kind of recirculating 20-year-old stories about, things which had happened in Byker.
In Byker, we had to make sure we had all of our ducks in a row, that we had a proactive communication strategy that was internal communications and external communications, including the local newspapers. So I invited the editors of the local newspapers to lunch and basically said, why do you keep doing this to Byker? Some of the stories that you're telling are not even in Byker. They're in areas that are around it, but they're not in Byker. Stop it. Just stop it. You're not doing the city any justice by doing that. And inevitably the editors would say, well, it's our reporters and people like to read stories and it's sensationalism, etc. And I said, well, just please stop it. And at the same time, drip feed and positive news stories within the community and outside. So dealing with the media was an important factor. Dealing with that perception of antisocial behaviour meant that we had to take a quite radical approach. As you said earlier, having a zero tolerance approach with the police, where we would literally put boards up on a house and say, we've evicted this drug dealer and we're coming for you next. We just would not have that on the estate, and we would make sure that message was going out loud and clear. Until we got rid of all of what I would call the devils, and any vulnerable people then would be supported to make sure that they weren't going to be affected by anyone coming onto the estate, and making sure that we had a better economic mix of tenants to get a better mix on the estate, etc. was important. Having local lettings policies in different types of properties. So a third of the properties in the Byker Wall are one bedroom. Yeah. And that was honestly, that was a great thing, because the welfare reform, the bedroom tax, if you like, the under occupancy allowance, meant that one bedrooms became popular again overnight.
Irony,
nobody wanted them. And then this tax was applied and all of a sudden they were wanted again. So sometimes those changes were in our favour, if you like, other times they weren't. But certainly dealing with crisis situations from some of the welfare reforms was one thing that sticks in my mind, because the mental health issues that my staff would deal with on a daily basis were quite scary sometimes, supporting people and families through crisis situations.
I mean, it's one thing kind of going in at the beginning and doing consultation, people telling you that, and I'm sure there's lots of examples we could find up and down the country where people have done that, and then it all kind of dissipates and lose momentum. How did you kind of keep the momentum? How did you make that happen?
Well, this had to be an all-encompassing approach. So it started with staff recruitment and staff culture, with the fact that all of our adverts basically asked for a certain type of person, a proactive person, someone who has Jack Welch's 4 E's and the P, someone who really thrives on making a difference, a positive difference to people's lives, and making sure that the adverts and the job descriptions are all around that, and had an appraisal and competency framework which was all about a leadership approach, so that everybody had leadership responsibilities and had to take responsibility for what they did, but they were allowed to make decisions. We had a culture where challenge was the norm, so my staff would come and challenge me, and likewise I could challenge them. No one would be offended, and changing things without a bureaucratic process was really, really important. Usually the communications which were worked up and down the organisation was structured. I'm a great believer in what gets measured gets done. So we'd measure what staff were feeling, we'd measure what their issues were and do something about it. We'd measure the agendas and all of the communications to make sure everybody got the same message and that they took ownership of what was going on. And that was a congruent type of leadership approach, because at the same time we had management and leadership development courses. All staff were having a 16 PF psychometric test to make sure that they were self-aware and if they had any blind spots, moving that on with the leaders to a Belbin approach. And then once we got that in place, we had a good to great, which is the Jim Collins book of what can we be great at Byker. And the staff came up with that we can be great at community engagement. Well, why wouldn't we? And we concentrated on that with the right people on the bus, moving in the right direction.
So there's a huge part there about having the right staff with a shared sense of purpose. What about the residents? I mean, how were they brought into decision making and governance and so on? Yeah,
well, that was really important if you think about the 4 community engagement strategy strands that they come back to us with, because it wasn't, again, you couldn't wave a magic wand and the community be empowered. It was a incremental thing where we worked with the groups on the ground and other groups, whether it's working with children, other professionals, whether it's something from Recycle Your Bike or the community centre who doing great work, whether it was through food as a conduit, because food poverty was a massive issue in the area, until that trust was built up and people were insightful and empowered, and then they started working on joint groups together, and we had a community engagement framework that took you right from the bottom groups where people were given a budget and worked towards a customer scrutiny committee, which became a formal committee of the board. And it's that formal committee, the tenants were remunerated, 4 of them, who sat on the board, so influenced governance at the highest level. But on the customer scrutiny committee, all residents, they influenced where investment went, community investment, performance and service review. So they decided what their services looked like. They decided what value for money looked like. And sometimes that wasn't about the cheapest service. It's about, we want this, because that's their choice.
Yeah.
So that was how it was a tiered effect and a grow your own right from the bottom. Could see residents starting at the local groups and working their way onto the customer scrutiny committee, and then when a tenant board member position came up, they were empowered enough to take that on. And I never had any problem with, once we had that structure in place, we never had any problem getting volunteers from the community to come and sit on the board, because they knew that they were empowered in a meaningful way. It wasn't about paying lip service. We could demonstrate that through the governance procedure, it was their priorities that were the priorities of the organisation.
Now, I guess this is all, in a way, all part of making Byker a better place to be, better place to live, and a place people want to live, and an estate where, rather than people looking for somewhere better, think this is where I want to be, and other people wanting to come live there. A huge amount of that's about the people, as we've talked about. A huge amount, as we touched on before, is also about the physical environment and the physical condition of the buildings and the public space and so on. And I know, as part of the trust, that you achieved an enormous amount. You achieved much more capital investment than was promised, actually, at the point of the kind of creation of the trust. But I also know that I think ultimately you felt you couldn't attract as much investment at the minute with Byker Community Trust as it stood, as was needed. I mean, do you want to just say a little bit about the whole kind of capital investment thing and where you thought ultimately, really, you couldn't perhaps go as far as you wanted to do in terms of...
Yeah, I had to be creative to be able to modernise the area as much as we could, because I only had enough to do the essential investment. That's compliance, fire, safety works, etc. And the tenants all wanted new kitchens, bathrooms, new internal doors.
And I think when we've talked before, you've said how if repairs got done, they got done piecemeal. In a way, me as an owner occupier would never do. Your sink breaks, so that just that bit of the sink would be replaced, and the rest would stay the same. Yeah. So. And then the environment was totally overgrown. It had basic maintenance for decades, and it needs a total overhaul. And it was great because tenants stopped wanting to move, and they stopped moaning about crime and fear of crime and kids bouncing the ball off the walls and
taking drugs on the corner, all of that was gone, and it was now about, actually, we want this from you and we want that from you, which were about, it was about investment and transformation, curb appeal. You know, we want new fencing, we want new kitchens, we want new bathrooms, we want internal doors, so that their needs and wants became something completely different over a 9-year period, which was great, but we could never have afforded that. Our modernisation, we had enough money to keep the estate safe and decent, but we could never have afforded to give like a whole-scale programme of new kitchens and bathrooms, which is what the tenants wanted, and to be fair, deserved, because the scheme that the council had rolled out throughout the city was based on grant funding they got from the government, which was about replacing on a needs-only basis. So they did a condition survey of kitchens and bathrooms, and Mrs. Cannybody, who'd looked after our kitchen and bathroom, unfortunately didn't get a new one, whereas people who'd had damage would get component replacement. Yeah. So it's understandable that the tenants wanted that, and we didn't have that. So we really had to have a long and hard discussion with residents and with the board about, well, if this is what tenants want, do we continue to go in the same direction and do what we do? Because if we do what we always do, they'll get what they've always got. Or are we really empowering the community and moving with their decision, which meant going into a partnership with a bigger organisation who had the capital means to give tenants what they wanted, which was transformation of the environment, new kitchens, bathrooms, and new aesthetic improvements.
I mean, it's all back to, in a way, what I started off by talking about, that, you know, people deserve a decent house to live in, and that attitude, oh, well, we'll just replace a bit, you know, it's a very kind of grudging, like, we're doing you a favour, really, rather than it being an expectation that people have decent places to live. So, as you said, I mean, all that really led to the conclusion that it was time for a new stage, really, in the evolution of the Byker approach and the work which you'd done there. So, do you just want to say a little bit about that and how you managed to sort of do yourself out of a job in the process?
Yeah, well, we had a very limited budget for the environment. I think by the time we'd done the fire safety works in the environment that we had to do, we had about £3 million or £3.6 million. And a wish list for the community of about £13 million. So it doesn't take a brain surgeon to work out. We could never meet the aspirations of the tenants. That was just with environment. And therefore we had to do more surveys with residents to ask them what would they prefer. Would they prefer Byker Community Trust as their landlord and to continue to have decent homes, but not to the aspirational standards that they were expecting or wanting, or would they rather have another landlord who would continue the strategy of Byker Community Trust, which was about the co-creation, the empowerment of the community and informing decisions and services in a meaningful way, but it would be at the cost of a new landlord, if you like. And a lot of that feedback was about, we love Byker Community Trust, we love what you've achieved and what you're doing, and we would like to have you, but we want this more. So that was it, really. It was then about, what are your essential criteria to the community, and we'll make sure that we write a prospectus that would consider other partners who might be able to offer that amount of capital to give tenants what they want. So we looked for a housing association, the same as us, non-for-profit, and who had the same type of ethos as us and behaviours, strategy, etc., and had a big community ethos. We included him with that, and Carbon Homes were already working with us in one of three, or like there was three of us, three housing associations in a cost-sharing agreement arrangement where we shared services, and we had a existing relationship with them, so we knew that they were probably the nearest we were going to get to that. They're a great housing association with great staff, a big community ethos, and our tenants liked them, more importantly, already, so that was a no-brainer to go to them first to say, are you interested? Yeah. And of course they were.
No, I think that we're coming towards the end. I think, I mean, that's sort of a very kind of nice point to sort of come towards the end. But before we do, just thinking back in terms of your, you know, years of experience of Byker Community Trust, Have we missed anything which we really should talk about this morning in terms of things which are really important in your mind in terms of your experience and what you've learned and what we can learn from Byker over the last few years?
Definitely. This is all about how people feel. You know, the economics of Byker haven't changed. We still have 75% or thereabouts claiming universal credit of whatever amount. So the economics haven't changed. The way people feel and the way people behave has changed. The staff love working there. I loved working there. For me, out of my 40 years, that's been the best 10 years of my career, because the people are amazing in Byker. They're a very resilient, proud community, and I've worked in lots of similar communities, but I've never come across a community like Byker before, despite the challenges that the people face. And therefore, this leadership approach and co-creative culture could be applied in other similar areas, and it will make a difference. There's no doubt about it. It's the second time that I've used this management approach, and it's worked twice. Different prescription, different issues, but certainly it's all about people. The staff who you get on board for a start, and my staff team and my board were just fantastic. And that's important, to have the right people on the bus. The Jim Collins Good to Great Effect is all about the right people in the right areas at the right time, doing the right job.
Well, thank you, Jill. It's always inspirational listening to you and talking to you. So I very much enjoyed the conversation this morning. So, and you know, just to really finish on that point, the importance of kind of co-creation, the importance of people having some kind of control and agency in their lives. And it's, you know, it takes a lot of work to get there, but it's well worth it.